Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I hope you're doing so well. This is my second attempt at filming this video. Hopefully we're going to make it all the way through the video this time, because last time I think I managed to record 2 books in and then that was it for the day. So let's see if we can actually get through this whole pile of books today. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I've read recently. I tend not to do monthly reading wrap-ups on this channel. I don't know why, but I just prefer reviewing and wrapping up all of the books I've read in much bigger clumps. I think it'd be different if I read like 10 books a month, but I don't, especially not now. I have a total of 10 books to talk about. The first 5 I read in like the first 2 weeks of the year, and then I had a baby, and then the other 5 books are since then. So you can see where my reading slowed down. But I've been so excited to sit down and record this video because I have read just some really interesting books. I'm so excited to talk about the books I've read. I've read some really bad books. I've also found a new favourite book. I've also been keeping a reading journal this year and reviewing and writing my thoughts down on all of the books that I've been reading as I've been reading them, which I am so thankful for because my brain is currently a sieve. I hardly remember things, just normal things, let alone the books I've been reading, particularly pre-having a baby. So I'm very glad that I have this journal here to remind me of my thoughts and feelings on what I've read. So the first book that I read, the book that kicked off 2024, was probably my least favourite book of the year so far, and that was The Cru Prints by Holly Black. This is such a popular fantasy YA series. I feel like I see this book everywhere. However, although I feel like this book did do a good job of researching, I feel like the world was really well fleshed out and the lore that the kind of world was built on felt very well fleshed out and thought through. There wasn't much more than that I actually liked about the story, which is such a shame because I really wanted to like the story. The book follows a mortal girl called Jude, and she lives in the High Court of Fairy because the kind of fairy general to one of the kings has murdered her parents. He was her mother's lover at some point, and her mother has now married, had her children, and so he goes and murders them in a fit of rage, in a fit of jealous rage, and brings the children to Fairy. So you would think that given this very traumatic past, Jude would not be very happy living in the land of Fairy. However, all she wants is to fit in with this world. But because she is a mortal girl, she is treated awfully, including by the love interest of this story. I just couldn't get behind a romance where the love interest literally bullies the main character. I know people love him, and maybe his character arc explains how he behaves in this first book with a bit more depth. But from just reading this book, I do not get this romance. I really don't get it. I really don't like romances where one of the characters is just horrible to the other character and then love blooms from that. I also just feel like the plot was so random. I remember when I was in primary school and we had to do this exercise to learn how to write a story where we had a dice and we would roll the dice, and whatever number combination we came up with was a plot point that we had to add to the story, or a thing that we had to add into the story, and it was supposed to help you kind of track out how you write a story. This book felt a little bit like that. It felt like she was just randomly adding things to the story, and I don't know why we were adding them. It just didn't make sense sometimes. I feel like there were characters that were just thrown in so randomly and then we would never hear from them again. I feel like the plot did improve as the story went on. I found that by the end it picked up and I was enjoying it more, but not enough to pick up the second book. So that was a little bit of a disappointing start to the year because I really wanted to like this series. So then we go from my least favourite book of the year to what was, I don't know if it was my favourite or my second favourite. I would say it's my second favourite book of the year so far, which was The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. I loved this book. This was exactly the kind of book I needed when I read it. This book was pitched as Willy Wonka, but imagine that instead of Willy Wonka being a chocolate maker, he was a children's book author. That is the premise of this story, and it is just as wholesome and charming and heartwarming as it sounds. So we have this children's book author who wrote this really popular children's book series, but he hasn't written any books for quite a long time, and he's kind of just disappeared and nobody really knows what's happened to him. However, at the beginning of this book, we find out that he has written one final book to end this series, and not only has he written one more book, he is only going to publish one copy. And so he holds this competition where people are invited to his home, which is this island inspired by the island in his children's book series, and he is going to award one of these people with this copy of the book. Our main character is a young woman called Lucy. She is a teacher's aide, and her kind of biggest wish in life is to adopt one of the boys that she teaches, and she isn't able to adopt him because she doesn't have enough money in the bank, and it doesn't matter what she does, she just can never quite get the money that she needs to adopt him. And so she is told by social workers to just abandon this hope. She grew up absolutely loving this book series, and she is one of the people that is invited to go to this author's island and potentially win a copy of this book. I loved this book. I loved the mystery element to it. I feel like the riddles and the kind of puzzles that they have to solve on the island were really fun, and I feel like the author in this book reminded me of Gene Wilder's interpretation of Willy Wonka. I just pictured Gene Wilder as this author. There's a little bit of romance in this book, which I really liked. I really liked how that was done. If you want to feel happy, pick up this book. It will definitely make you feel happy. But I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. So the next book I read was the final book in a series, and that is A Curse for True Love by Stephanie Garber, which is the last book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. I gave the first 2 books in this series 5 stars because I really loved them. They were just pure escapist, guilty pleasure, fantasy romance books. They were just so much fun. I loved the romance, I loved the world, loved the characters, loved Stephanie Garber's writing. They were just a great fun time. And I was so sad because I really didn't like this last book. Without going into any spoilery details, I feel like the romance in this story, considering I would say this is a romance set in a fantasy world more than a fantasy with a romance. And to me, I feel like if you're gonna make a trilogy out of romance, the final book really needs to go really deep into that. But I felt like there were hardly any scenes with the 2 love interest characters together. The fantasy element to the story that had been building up in the first 2 books, which is around these magical arches, it just feels like they completely dropped that storyline. It just felt so unimportant in this book, which again, it's a final book. I feel like everything was supposed to come together, and it just felt like things were dropped. There's also a new antagonist that they bring into this book, but she's just really not that. She just doesn't feel that strong of a character to have brought into the final book. I feel like the final book's antagonist needs to be the worst of them all, and she just seemed really unintimidating to me. So yeah, overall, I just felt a bit disappointed with this book. The other 2 books had got 5 stars. I don't even know what I would give this, maybe like a 2.5 stars, because I really liked Stephanie Garber's writing. I still found this book engaging and quick to read, but yeah, just a disappointing final book to a series for me. So the 4th book that I got to this year was The Peach Keeper by Sarah Addison Allen, who is the author of Garden Spells, which I haven't read, but I know that a lot of people really love that book. So this book is set in a small town, and we follow two main characters, two 30-year-old women who both live very different lives, and yet they're kind of connected in their kind of family backgrounds. I believe both of their grandmothers were best friends. One of the women has bought this old house which once belonged to the other woman's family, and she's renovating it, and this kind of brings these two women back together when they discover this body buried beneath an old peach tree in the grounds of the property, and they start on a bit of a search to find out who this person was and what happened there and how their two families were interlinked with this story. I feel like I would recommend this in the category of books of, if you like Gilmore Girls, you might like this book because it's got that small town feel. There's romances, there's one of the main characters who really loves coffee and owns a coffee shop type place, and it definitely has that cozy feel, but it also has a bit more of an added layer of depth than a lot of kind of cozy small town romance novels have. I do feel though that one of the female characters I connected to far more than the other one. One of them seems to have a really clear character progression. I feel like her romantic storyline as well feels like it has a lot more believability and progression. The other character, her kind of character progression and her romantic plot feel a little bit more unbelievable, and I felt a bit of a disconnect from her. I also wish that the mystery element of this book would have been focused on perhaps a little bit more, because I feel like this would have been a perfect cozy mystery novel. I feel like it could have even been categorized as a cozy mystery if that element of the story had been focused on a little bit more. But on the whole, I did really enjoy this book. It definitely surprised me. I didn't really know what to think about it. It was just a book I picked up in a charity shop. I think I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then I picked up a classic that I've been wanting to read for years. This is such a popular classic. I feel like this is so many people's favourite classic, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I think it took me quite a while to get through. So all of those other books I was reading, I would read them and then I would come back to this book and read like 20 or 30 pages, and then I'd pick up the next book and then I'd come back to this and read 20 or 30 pages. So it was quite a staggered read, which isn't because this book wasn't good or gripping. I just found that I only wanted like a little bit of it at a time. A little bit like how you only want a little bit of dark chocolate in one go, whereas you know, you might have a bar of milk chocolate and be able to eat the whole thing, but with dark chocolate, you just want little bits spaced out. I feel like that was what this book was like for me. This is, of course, a classic tale about a man called Dorian Gray. He has his portrait done by this painter. Dorian Gray kind of makes a deal with the devil, sells his soul to not get older and not to lose his beauty. As a result, this portrait starts to take on all of the aging and all of the ugliness from Dorian Gray, so that he remains young and beautiful and the painting grows older and uglier. However, the uglier this painting gets outwardly, the uglier Dorian Gray gets inwardly. And this is really a book about a character who just succumbs to all sin and lust and evil acts and just becomes more and more awful as the book goes on. I absolutely loved Oscar Wilde's writing. I feel like I wish I'd annotated this book because there are so many quotes that I wish I'd remembered. Apparently Oscar Wilde once said that the books that the world calls immoral are books that show the world its own shame. I feel like this book made a really good point, but I found it hard to enjoy reading this book. Like I could tell it was a good book, and I would definitely agree that it is a great classic, but I wouldn't say it has become a favourite classic of mine. I didn't particularly enjoy reading it, and I don't know if it's a book I would reread. So I don't feel like I can even rate this book because it's obviously a 5-star classic. Do you ever have that experience where you know a book is just really good, but it's just not your book, you know? That's how I felt about this. So a really good read. I'm really glad I read it. I probably won't read it again. I don't know if I'm sticking to the 2 minutes per book thing here. This will just be as long as it will be. So we've got 5 more books to talk about. These are all the books I've read postpartum. The first book that I finished was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the sequel to Divine Rivals, which was one of my absolute favourite books of last year. I absolutely love that book. Rebecca Ross is one of my favourite fantasy writers at the moment. I love her fantasy books. So we're following on from the events of book 1, in which there is this war going on between these 2 opposing gods, and we're following 2 characters, Iris and Roman, who are both journalists, and they are journaling and documenting the war. I absolutely loved the first book in this duology. I loved Divine Rivals. It was a 5-star read, and I feel like although this book was really good, it just didn't live up to how much I loved the first book. I loved Rebecca Ross's writing. I feel like her storytelling is always so beautiful. I love the pacing of her stories. But I felt as though I kind of wish that Divine Rivals had just been a standalone book. I kind of just wish that that book had wrapped up and not left on a cliffhanger, and that we hadn't had a sequel. I think it would have been a much more powerful book on its own. This series is definitely what would be termed romantasy. It's a romance with a fantasy world, and the first book had the romance at the forefront of the book. The war was going on in the background, there were fantasy elements, but it was the romance that, at least for me, I was reading the book for. So for me, I didn't enjoy so much that this book switched the focus much more onto the war storyline, and even though the romance was part of it, it felt much more in the background. It was like the importance of the 2 had switched over. I just think that for me, perhaps with fantasy, I'm starting to prefer standalone books a lot more than series. I think I gave this book 3.5 stars. So the next book I read was a book I picked up. I have the physical copy, but I ended up listening to most of it because I was finding that with being up a lot in the night, I wanted something that I could read whilst not having my hands free. The book was Upon a Frosted Star by M.A. Kuznia. In this book we follow Forster, who is a struggling artist living in London, and he attends this really lavish, mysterious party in this manor house. Once a year, invites get sent out in mysterious ways to go and attend this party, and it's very kind of Great Gatsby-esque in its style. I think it was set in the 1920s as well. And he starts to kind of get wrapped up in the mystery and the terrible dark story that has happened to the owner of this manor. This was a Swan Lake retelling with kind of Great Gatsby undertones, which to me sounded amazing. I feel like that was a recipe for a book I was gonna love. At first, I found myself really enjoying this book. However, after a really great setup to the story, I feel like it just went downhill from about a third of the way in. From about halfway into the book, we get a new character's perspective, and I found myself really loving that perspective and enjoying those chapters, and starting to lose interest in Forster's chapters. I think what potentially went wrong in this book, for me anyway, is that the protagonist of the story was the wrong perspective for the story. I feel like his perspective was much less interesting and moved a lot less quickly than the storyline of the female perspective. I feel like she was the most interesting character, and we were just following the perspective of an onlooker. I think if it had only been Forster's perspective, then that would have been different, but because her perspective was added in, his then became less interesting to me. I also feel like the villain of this story could have been made so much more prevalent in the story. I feel like he just kind of appears at the end and his engagement in the story is so anticlimactic. So yeah, I think I gave this a 2.5 stars, maybe a 3 stars. Loved the storytelling, loved the world, loved the narration of the audiobook. I actually listened to this on 1 times speed, or maybe like 1.2 times speed, which normally I would listen to audiobooks on at least 2 times speed. But I really enjoyed the narration and wanted to listen to it as it was recorded. But yeah, I just feel like I lost interest. It was the wrong perspective and it just ended in a very anticlimactic way. So after reading quite a few books that just sort of fell somewhere in the middle for me, I then picked up another 5-star read. So the next book that I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. We follow a Fleetwood Mac kind of inspired band. I don't know if it is inspired by Fleetwood Mac, but it feels very much like that. It's a 70s rock band, and the kind of male and female lead singers, the focus of the story is kind of their relationship and the intensity of their relationship and the highs and lows that that brings to the band and to their personal and family lives. I really love Taylor Jenkins Reid. I feel like every book I've read by her has moved me so much. What she's really good at is giving you a storyline and characters who are so far away from normal reality. Like, they're so far away from anything that the normal person is going to experience, and yet she makes you relate to them. I think every single book I've read of her so far I have cried at, and this is definitely no exception. This is my favourite Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I've read so far. Loved the way the story was told as well. It's written in a kind of interview style. It reads like watching a Netflix documentary, and it also allows for these little discrepancies of information. So one character saying that something happened, and then another character will say the same thing but it's slightly different, and I really enjoyed that because it felt very real. Really enjoyed this. Definitely want to read more books by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Okay, we're nearing the end. I then picked up Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett, which is the sequel to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Again, that was one of my favourite books of last year. I gave that book 5 stars, really loved it. And so I was really excited to pick up the sequel. This series follows a Cambridge professor named Emily Wilde, who is a professor of Dryadology, which is the study of fairies. And in this version of our world, it is commonly believed that fairies exist, and their existence has been proven, so it is now an academic study. The first book follows her as she goes on a journey to create the first encyclopedia of fairies, and this book follows on from the events of that book. I really enjoyed this book. I love these stories. I think that the interactions and dialogue between Emily and the other main character, Wendell, are just my favourite thing about these books. I love the dialogue between the two of them. I love their sarcastic banter. I also feel like all of the additional characters that were added into this story were such worthwhile additions. I think it can be really hard to make us love a side character, but I feel like the side characters that were added felt like they had a lot of purpose being in the book, particularly the character of Rose. He was such a good addition. One of those characters that you kind of hate at the beginning and grow to love throughout the story. Overall, I did find the story and the plot in this book a little bit less enjoyable than the first one, but I do wonder if I had reread the first book straight away before reading this book, if I would have felt differently. I think that part of it is just that I had forgotten so much of the detail of the first book, and this book doesn't really handhold in the sense of it doesn't really remind you of what happened in the first book. You just have to pick up and follow on. And so I think when the third book comes out, I am definitely going to do a reread of the first and second and read it all through, because I think that part of why I didn't enjoy this book as much as the first one was just because I had forgotten so much of what had happened and was out of the world. But overall, I did enjoy this book. I felt like it was a good addition to the series, and I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So now we reach the most recent book that I have finished, and This is my favourite book that I've read so far this year and has probably become one of my favourite books ever, and that was The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. L.M. Montgomery is the author of Anne of Green Gables, but this is L.M. Montgomery's adult novel. I don't know if she has other adult novels, but this is written for adults and it's a standalone. We follow 29-year-old Valency Sterling, who is considered an old maid because she has not married, she has not found love, and she is still living with her family. Her family are pretty awful. To them, appearances mean everything, and so they have a lot of disappointment when it comes to Valency. They treat her like a child. She has to kind of do as she's told. Meanwhile, at the beginning of this book, we discover that she is having pain around her heart, and finally she decides that she's going to go to a doctor and try and find out what's going on. This is what kind of fuels her to change her life around and to take charge of her life once and for all. As you can see, I annotated this book and I tabbed so much of this book because I loved it so much. I was actually going to make a reading vlog of reading this book, but I then just read the whole book, so it would have made a very interesting reading vlog. There's a romance in this book and I loved it. It was so beautiful. It's one of those romances that starts out very one-sided, but as the book goes on, the characters find this real depth of love for each other. I absolutely love this book. I feel like I could make a whole video talking about this book. There are so many really beautiful themes. I had a very similar feel reading this book to the feel I had reading Frenchman's Creek by Daphne du Maurier, in the sense that this is a romance novel, but the romance is really there to highlight the inner strength and growth of the main character. I also felt kind of similar to reading Where the Crawdads Sing in terms of the nature writing in this book. L.M. Montgomery's descriptions of nature are the most beautiful. Valency definitely has some similarities to Anne in her character, particularly towards the end of the book when she has decided she's going to just live the way she wants to live. But the character growth and development in this book is so lovely. The romance is so lovely. The descriptions of the world around them are so beautiful. And I know this is going to be a book that I reread many times. So those are all of the books that I've read recently. Let me know what you've been reading recently. Have you found a new favourite book? What's your favourite book that you've read so far this year? And I'd also love to know your thoughts on any of the books that I've mentioned in this video. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are in this world, and I will see you very soon with another video.